all her lovely things that she brought from Italy. My Aunt Ada played with matches and set fire to the thing. Goofy.
And tell them about 1938, when...
Oh, the hurricane? I was 9 years old, right?
Yes, but even before that, when you used to go to the Sisters on Toby Street, where I also went. Do you remember that? Remember they had the big parade?
Oh, yeah, and that's right, I remember now. My mother and father, I guess my mother found out that I was really being neglected, so early in the morning she would drop me off at Bell Street. You know, the nursery at Bell Street? Mm-hmm. And I would go there. And I liked being there. That was very nice. I played with the kids. For some reason, I didn't get lice in my head like my sister Doris did. Because what they did was they would put little veils on the little girls and go into chapel. And of course, the veils were interchangeable. And who knows what was living in one of those little veils. But no, I never remember getting lice, but I remember my sister Doris and how my mother would hold her between her knees and clean her hair. But anyway.
Did your grandparents get along?
My grandparents? Well, that's a whole sack of honey. That's not too pleasant.
Let's hear it.
Well, my grandfather came from a genteel family in Italy, and he was one of the younger sons. And because he was one of the younger sons, of course, he got no property. So what the family wanted for him, they thought he should be a priest. So they sent him to what's that place up on the hill?
Monte Cassino.
Monte Cassino. And he was educated at Monte Cassino. He must have received a very good education because he was literate and he appreciated music and he was an educated man. So the time came he didn't want to be a priest, so he came to the United States. But it was lonesome, so his family arranged a marriage for him. They took an artist family from Avezzano who had a lovely daughter, and my grandfather never even met her, and they got married. And he promised her that she would live like a queen in the United States. And my grandmother was not prepared for the kind of life that my grandfather had in store for her. She was a very, very unhappy woman because it wasn't that way at all. They lived in a tenement and he had a wage, he had a job, but she had to do her own stuff. She had to do her own housework and her own cooking and all that stuff. And she wasn't prepared for that kind of stuff.
Did she have a job?
Are you kidding? Of course not. Her job was, of course, she had 3 children, biff, bang, biff. That's one way these guys keep these women in tow, you know. Mm-hmm. You know that. So when it got to be, I guess her family got tired of hearing her complain in her letters, so they arranged for her to go back home to Avezzano. And that was the start of World War I.
When she got back there?
No.
Oh.
Before she got on the boat. And they stopped the travel to Italy. My mother says she can remember my grandmother crying for weeks because she couldn't leave.
Did she trying to go with the kids or without the kids?
She was going to go with the kids, all 3 of them. She was going to take them back home to her mother and father. So that was, I don't know, that was tragic. So my grandmother, she just coped with it.
Did she ever get to go back?
No. The happiest time my grandmother had was moving to California.
Well, let's get to that a little bit later then.
Yeah.
When did you hear about Avezzano? Do you remember that, with the earthquake?
I don't remember. It was just always talked about, you know.
It was something that was passed. You were much before you.
Of course. It was in 1918 or...
What was it? What happened?
No, wait a minute. Was it World War II or the...
No, it was World War I.
World War I or the earthquake? I think my mother said it was World War I. Mm-hmm. The earthquake must have come after that.
I think it did.
Yeah.
So you don't remember them talking about that, except it happened.
Except it happened, yeah. And I remember my grandmother being very grieved. She cried a lot. And of course her house was always a mess. They used to have somebody come in and wash this and do that, and my grandma never did any housework. She learned to cook somehow, though, because one of the things that my grandfather did when I think even it was even before I was born, when my mother was just a youngster. He opened a restaurant downstairs where he ultimately opened the grocery store, and he ran this restaurant. And he had a chef called Yadik. Yadik, his name was. My mother used to say. I wouldn't even know how to spell it. And my grandmother learned to cook from him. And since then, my grandmother would cook. She was really a very, very good cook. Cleaning up, that was something else. She used to have Teresa come in and clean up. I remember Teresa. But my grandmother had a very unhappy life.
So why else was not happy
Oh.
after that? I mean, it sounds like the whole idea of going back to Italy went away when Avanzano was born. That was well before you were born.
Yeah.
So do you remember her being an unhappy woman after that?
Well, not so you notice. She was just, she was always placid and sanguine. I mean, she was always pleasant. Always pleasant. She was always nice to me. She'd cook me lunch when I'd walk home. I'd go to the Federal Street School over where the Federal. Do you know where St. Joseph's is now, on the corner of Dean Street and Federal Street? There used to be a primary school there, and I was enrolled in that when I was 5.5 years old, and they put me right in the first grade. So I started school early, and we'd walk all the way home to lunch and back to school again.
Were you speaking English in your house when you were growing up?
Oh yeah, my mother and dad never spoke Italian. The only way I learned Italian was when I used to help my grandfather in his grocery store, and most of his customers were Italian, and I learned to speak it quite very well. I thought. I did, but...
What do you mean you thought?
Well, when I got self-critical, when I took Italian in school, I didn't appreciate the way I was speaking, so my Italian slowed up. But I know it when I hear it. I understand Italian spoken very well. And that's more than I can say for French. I took 6 years of French. I took 3 years in high school, another 3 years in college. 6 years I took of it. I can read and write it like you can't believe it. Like I could read and write it like you couldn't believe. But as for understanding it spoken or speaking it, the schools they fail in that respect, So I had a similar problem with Italian. See, the Italian it was spoken so well, but when I tried to talk to Grandpa's cousins in Pico, they don't understand me. They just don't understand me.
So you talked to Peter when he came back here in Italian, Peter and John?
My mother and father, we used to speak in English. They learned English very quickly.
Okay.
Yeah, and of course my mother and father knew Italian, so the kids had an easy time assimilating. Yeah. Okay, what else you want to know?
So you went to that primary school when you were 5?
Yes, nice.
And where were you living then?
We were living in one of the tenements in my grandfather's house.
And your grandfather, he owned the house?
Yeah, he owned the whole house, and he owned the basement where once he had the restaurant, and then he had the grocery store.
You opened a grocery store that you
But I didn't work in the grocery store till I was about 10 or 11. Yeah.
So even though you guys weren't talking, that your mom wasn't talking to your grandparents, you'd still live in there?
But that was, they had reconciled.
Oh, they had reconciled by then, okay.
Yeah, they had reconciled by that time. I would say by 2 or 3 years old,
Yeah.
They somehow got together.
Where was that exactly? The house?
Federal Hill. 98 Atwells Avenue, right where the highway is now.
Oh, okay.
House isn't there anymore.
My grandfather, I think my father sold it for my grandfather for $14,000. He
Wow.
sold it to the city of Providence.
When they were building 95.
I guess so. But my grandfather was in California at that time, so my father would collect the rents for him and send it off to him.
And so you got that your grandparents moved to California.
Yes.
How old were you then?
I was 16 years old.
Oh, so that's a lot later.
Yeah.
What
It was after the war. When my Uncle Eddie came back from the war, he couldn't stand the cold winter. So he talked and of course his brother Silvio was already there. And so he and my grandparents and my Aunt Ada and Uncle Fred, they all moved to California.
That was
When I was about 16, 1946.
so before you got married.
46, 47. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I would spend August in California with my grandmother and grandfather for about 4 or 5 years. We'd take the train because by that time my father had railroad passes, you know, and he'd hire a Pullman, which was extra, and we'd live on the train like it was a hotel. It was lovely, you know. Good menus. We'd have a berth. I'd be on the top with my sister and my mother and father being the bottom berth. They were that large, and it was fun. I liked that.
How old were you when your sister was born?
5 years old, almost to the day, because she was born November 1st and I was born November 3rd.
Were you guys pretty close growing up?
No, not at all.
Why is that?
I don't know. It might have been the age difference. It might be that they just kept us apart where some people would take care of Doris and I was left on my own and stuff. I don't know. But no, we were never close. She was always a pain in